They told me to leave as though I were a trespasser on the land my grandfather laid stone by stone. The invitation said open bar and black tie, not history. The estate rose above the drive like something borrowed from a different century. Columns flanked by manicured hedges, a fountain whose spray caught the late sun, a long cobblestone approach polished by decades of footsteps. Crystal hung from the tented reception like a constellation you could taste. Guests arrived in shimmering gowns and tuxedos, in shoes that clicked like metronomes against marble. They laughed at their own jokes in the kind of way that tells you laughter is also currency. I had not planned to come. I told myself it was better to watch from the curb, to let the evening pass without stirring. But the oak on the east lawn has my grandfather's initials carved into its bark, so deep the letters had become part of the tree. The plaque at the gate, the brass plate with Washington Estate in bold relief, had been removed. Someone had left a square of darker metal where it had been. That, more than anything, drew me the way a moth is drawn to a flame. I wanted to see what had been done to a place that had been ours for a century. When security stopped me at the steps, the first voice that cut through the music belonged to Victoria Bradford. She stood near the entrance like the sun, all white lace and posture. Her voice was designed to command rooms. "This is a private event," she said, only loud enough for a few to overhear, and louder for everyone to hear. There was a flinch of expectation in the crowd, a little wave that ran along the line of people. Here comes someone who will deliver a performance for a room full of strangers. Victoria found the exact tone that meant, observe me humiliating someone, admire the severity of my standards. "Do you have an invitation?" she asked me, sweet as a snapped twig. I closed my jacket around the briefcase at my feet. The case was ordinary, black leather, a brass latch that had been sporting scuffs from being carried under all kinds of rain. Inside, it was anything but ordinary. There were deeds, one stamped 1924 when my grandfather first filed his name with the county, tax receipts covering 2 decades, a surveyor's map that bore my family's name along its borders, a trust agreement from a bank that no longer operates under its old windowed logo, inheritance papers with signatures my mother had taught me to recognize. I had brought them because sometimes proof requires you to stand where the wrongs were done, to look up at the people who assumed your silence. "I do," I said. My voice did not carry the tremor I felt. There is a way the body knows to preserve face, especially in public, and my training, years on the bench, kept my speech like a measured gavel. Victoria smiled the way a person smiles before pulling a curtain open to reveal something that will embarrass you. "I'm sure you have a story," she said, theatrical pity folding around her like a stole. "But this is not the place for memories. The staff has been instructed." She did not finish. Her hand flicked toward the nearest security man with the sort of practiced subtlety that meant the rest of the guests could pretend the command had never been said. Around us, murmurs gathered. Someone in a pink dress near the fountain leaned in with the intense curiosity of someone watching the first act of a scandal unfold. A wedding guest named Harrison, a man who had the habit of repeating other people's punchlines as if they proved his intelligence, made a small joke that landed as a pinprick in the air. Laughter protected the laughing. "Ma'am," the security man said, using the deference reserved for strangers who might become tabloids. In his face I saw the calculation. Intervene and be remembered. Step back and be forgiven. He reached for my arm. "Please," I said, folding my hands like a petitioner. "I was here before the tent, before the florist. I grew up under that oak. My name is Angela Washington." The moment the name left my mouth, a pause cracked the music at the edge. You could hear a dozen small gasps, like the opening of champagne flutes. That pause, that fraction of time, is dangerous in a room full of people who need to reassign you to a category. To them, I was to be a script, the uninvited, the spectacle, the person they could lift up, not to hear from, and then set down. To speak now was to insist on being seen where they preferred you invisible. Washington? Victoria's eyebrow arched, as if the paper invitation might have accidentally printed the wrong century. I'm not sure. She doesn't belong here, a woman near the flowered arch said loudly enough that several heads turned. The sentence was a work of architecture, built to carry a weight it could not support. It had no evidence, only the authority of the room behind it. Thomas, the groundskeeper, had been sweeping debris near the pergola. He froze. I could see his hand lift toward the broom, fingers tightening, as if to steady himself. Thomas had been on these grounds longer than the chandeliers had been hung. He had a way of looking at stone and naming its age. He was the first person who did not pretend not to know me. His eyes met mine, and in them I read a long narrative of loyalty and fear. He did not speak, but he did not walk away. I had practiced reactions for years, solutions to slights, methods for diffusing public indignity. None of that mattered when the insults are small knives that cut beneath the skin. Victoria's barbs were not vivid. They were white-gloved, precise, and they hurt because everyone in that room was examining me for entertainment. The photographer's lens turned, a black eye that framed me in 1,000 little rectangles that could be sold, shared, and reinterpreted. He leaned close enough that I could smell his powder and aftershave. "You need to move on," he whispered, as if he were offering me a chance to protect his shot, not my dignity. I sat on a stone bench near the fountain. The briefcase rested at my side like a faithful dog. People circled as vultures circle sun-bleached bone. But there are different kinds of vultures. Some are curious, some are hungry. Others come because there is a story everyone wants to tell themselves about themselves. A child in a white suit pressed his face to a mother's arm and asked why the strange woman was crying. Nobody answered him. Niceties have an elbow. They can push a question out of the way. I opened the briefcase with the kind of calm that surprises onlookers. There is theater in the act of taking out paper. The rustle becomes evidence. Guests stepped back as if a wind had shifted. I made no speech. I simply began to lay things out, one by one, methodically. The deed, yellowing at the corners with ink that had survived a century. Certified tax receipts spanning 20 years. A property survey printed on vellum-thin paper with measurements and bearings that matched the curve of the drive. The trust document with the name of the bank and the notation of payments sent. A photograph of my grandfather shaking hands with local tradesmen, his face young and certain, with the oak tree behind him like an ancient sentinel. Someone from the bridal party, Margaret, approached and reached for a paper as if documents must be handled with gloved hands. "This must be misfiled," she said, her voice the sound of a person being taught to navigate a new religion. "It's clearly—" "It's not," Thomas said from behind the hedge. His voice surprised me. It was low and steady and edged with something that had gathered over years of watching the unspoken. He stepped closer. "They paid the tax here every year. I collected the mail when Mr. Washington was alive. I seen them checks go through." Silence pressed in. Thomas had spoken plainly, without the tremor of entitlement or fear of repercussion. He had spoken with the authority of someone who keeps ledgers in his head. The gardener's testimony matters in ways people outside that life rarely understand. It anchors the narrative in soil and sweat. A woman near the bar cupped her hand over her mouth, and for a second, the music felt like it had to decide which side it would be on. "You've probably been paid off," a man in a dark suit suggested, eager to resolve discomfort with a conspiracy. "It happens. People like clean stories." "They never paid me off," Thomas said. "They paid wages. They fortified this place with money that came through the Washington Trust. They signed my ledgers. They know my boy's name. What they don't know is that the name on the deed was never their own. He looked at Victoria, and his eyes had the simple, honest weight of a witness. Victoria's face had the immediate flush of a woman whose narrative is momentarily inconvenient. When your identity is built on being the center of a room, any interruption becomes a threat. She snapped her fingers at her lawyer, a man named Richard Pekalatan, whose suit was cut to transform his shoulders into a platform for his confidence. "Find out who is playing this game," she told him. "Call someone. Call the county. This is obviously a stunt." I did not have to explain why the deed mattered. Legal documents have an alphabet of their own, but they are also stubbornly tactile. A stamp, a raised seal, a signature in a handwriting that cannot be erased by a gossip column. They translate history into ownership. A flashback rose up, sudden and sharp. Not the cinematic kind with piano strings, but the kind that takes over your attention because a memory sits beside a smell or a detail. I was a child again, barefoot on the gravel driveway, following my grandfather as he hummed while he walked. He had the habit of pausing at the oak and running his hand along the letters he had carved when he was my age. "This is what we sweat for," he would say, wiping his palms on his trousers. "You remember this when the lights go out." There were other nights. I remembered my father on the phone in the kitchen, voice small with a worry he refused to show in daylight. It was the late 1990s. Banks were changing names. A cousin had married into a trust that liked the sound of clean hands. "Keep everything," he told me in a whisper, as if the walls could hear. "Don't let them peel it away." I was too young to understand the paper's power then. I learned later that losing land is not like losing an object. It is like being told you no longer belong in a story you were born inside. The crowd tightened into a human shoal. A man in a tuxedo, Harrison again, declared loudly, "This is going to be excellent, a story for the ages." He had the fluency of a person who measures his life in anecdotes. Someone else, a lady with a string of pearls, called me obviously confused, dear, as if confusion were the polite umbrella under which one could hide cruelty. Words like confused and mistaken have a way of pretending to be charity. I did not let the room's reclassification of me cloud my purpose. The documents were not there to shame any one person. They were a rectification of paper. They were evidence that told a quieter story, that the estate's chain of title included my family, that taxes had been paid under accounts referencing my mother's initials, that salaries had been disbursed through a trust account that bore my grandfather's name. The paper was patient. It only needed to be read. "Why did your family leave?" a woman in a mauve dress asked, curiosity masking itself as concern. I told her the short version, because there are stories people tell themselves to make a wound tolerable. "There was an offer," I said, "a consolidation. Things shifted. We were told it was better for us. My family trusted the wrong feeling." "We" is easy to say "better for us" and be believed. It is harder to say "we were deceived" and have someone look past their own reflection. The truth was that a combination of mismanagement, families moving away, and quiet bureaucratic reshuffling, underweighted in the right places, had taken its toll. A surveyor's mistake, a notarized signature lost in a stack of papers, a trust document moved from one bank to another. These things add up if you do not have the time or the money to watch every box. A voice at the tent's nearest table cut across. "Are you accusing the Bradfords of theft?" the man in the tux asked, as if theft were a foreign term in a place that claimed to be above such plainness. "I'm not accusing," I said, "and diligence is a flavor of mercy. I'm presenting what the public records show. You are welcome to verify them." I said public records because the phrase carries a certain weight. It implies a ledger you can take to a clerk and have stamped. It implies a truth that is not kept in whispers. If humiliation is a theater, then sometimes the audience will decide whether to boo or to look away. In that room, most people shuffled their feet like choir members deciding on their parts. A few continued to film with their phones under the veil of documentation. The photographer clicked and aimed, seeking the angle that would sell the narrative, if only the narrative were simplified. I had rehearsed for this, if rehearsed is the right word. As a judge, I learned to prepare for statements that were designed to inflame, insults wrapped in civility. Mercy was not about weakness, it was about preserving your center in front of the storm. I had once, in my courtroom, looked at a young man named Michael Bradford, then 19, handcuffed and raw, sentenced him to a shorter term than the prosecutor asked for, and said, "There is a different life inside you if you choose to find it." It was not a dramatic line, it was a deliberate choice. That choice would become the hinge of this evening, though I did not know it yet. Mercy has a way of sprouting in the most unlikely places. At some point, someone fed a rumor that the law offices in the back had been paid a retainer. Richard Pecton had been seen moving through the crowd with an air of a man who keeps a crisis protocol in his head. Victoria's smile had narrowed to a line of steel. People love to watch a confrontation. They will take sides for the narrative's sake rather than for truth. The more their category system is threatened, the louder they become. "Do you have identification?" Victoria asked abruptly, gesturing to my papers as if legality were a costume she could inspect. I pulled out my driver's license, then the federal judge's identification card I keep for over travel and conference check-ins, small things you carry to remind yourself that you occupy a space. They glanced at the badge like children at a new toy. Items can have the power to reorder a room. The photographer hesitated. For a moment, the lens paused like a heartbeat between two beats. "How do you prove ownership?" Harrison wanted to know. He was never satisfied with anything less than a spectacle. "Deeds," I said, "receipts, county tax records, trust documents, witness statements, the physical presence of the family naming on the ledger." I said it plainly because legal terminology, when it drifts into the exotic, becomes accessible only to those who want to be allies. The ordinary facts are often the strongest. Someone had the idea to record the scene and tag the county clerk online. Viral justice is a myth, paperwork is not. Yet the idea planted itself in the air, as if a hashtag could substitute for verification. This is how we manage the world now. We document, we amplify, and we sometimes stop short of the work that would make the story true. "You're making a spectacle," Victoria hissed. "This is a wedding. People are trying to celebrate." "This is my family's property," I replied. "I will not be celebrated or erased in the same breath." That line, firm, undramatic, did something the room did not expect. It narrowed the margin of polite cruelty into a question. "Do you find me inconvenient because I refuse to be erased?" Some people shifted uncomfortably. Others smiled as if to say, "Find someone else." At that precise discomfort, Detective Ray Coleman entered the scene like a punctuation mark. He is the sort of man who appears ordinary until you realize he remembers the exact make of car you drove 5 years ago and the color of the rain that fell the day he took your statement. He had been called by someone who thought a trespasser might become a problem. He moved through the gathering with an ease that suggested duty rather than performance. "Can I have a word?" he asked, nodding in my direction. His voice carried the steady timbre of someone accustomed to human contradiction. He looked at the papers laid out, then at the way people circled them as if engaged in a new sport. He lifted his phone, the small, ordinary device that has become the repository for more truth than any iron safe, and tapped. He typed my name as one might try a key. We were both aware that a public record is a thing that can be summoned in a moment. It is a quiet, bureaucratic weapon that demands attention. "Detective," a woman said with the practiced tone of someone who has rehearsed being insulted, "we have our lawyer inside. We have a wedding to conduct." "That's understood," Ray answered. He did not sound like a man who could be hurried by sentiment. He pulled up a county page, the kind that is bland to the eye but lethal in the clarity of its entries. There were land records, stamps, the dates on which conveyances had been filed. His thumb moved the screen while the crowd leaned in as if huddled around a small bonfire. It is a strange thing to watch a room turn toward a screen. For a moment, the bubble of gossip deflated into an awkward silence. People read differently than they talk. When a document is before them, their fingers stop flailing for opinions. Ray scrolled, and the names appeared: addresses, parcel numbers, the notations of transfers. A dated entry caught his eye. He tapped again, the movement small. A man whose gestures are not designed for show. "You know her?" Victoria asked the detective sharply. There was a thinness to the question that sounded like a knife disguised as curiosity. Ray's gaze flicked to me and then back to his screen. His face changed minutely. A professional register, as if a courtroom had opened a door in his chest. For the briefest moment, he seemed to locate me in a map of places he had visited as part of his work. "I ran into her before," he said finally, "in a courthouse. She helped a young man a few years back. Angela Washington, federal bench." The room exhaled a different kind of breath. The name had weight. It is the kind of thing ceremony cannot easily override. Conversation resumed, but with a different soundtrack now. The rustle of reassessment, the shuffling of people moving to update their internal logs. Photographers angled for a new frame. Margaret fanned herself like someone trying to cool a fever. I felt something that is hard to name in a public room. The neatness of being recognized for something beyond the shape of your coat. Recognition is sometimes a small stair that allows you to climb out of being categorized. But I carry an old caution with me, the knowledge that power is a complicated thing. To be recognized is not to be safe. When I said my name and my title, I had not intended to use them as leverage. I had not come to the wedding to demand a show of authority. The papers were the evidence. The title was simply a part of me that the world would now compute into their calculations. But titles do change how some people speak. You can see it in the way voices adjust, soften, or sharpen. Before Ray could continue his search in earnest, Victoria's lawyer placed himself between her and the crowd like a practiced shield. "Detective," he said smoothly, "we understand procedure, but this is a private matter between a family and guests. If there's a legal question, take it to the courthouse tomorrow. Now is not." Ray looked at him the way a man looks at formalism when it contradicts his duty. "If it's civil, I can point you to the clerk," he said. "If there's a possible crime." "There's no crime," Victoria said quickly, as if speed might inoculate her from the evening's contagion. "This is harassment." The word harassment fell into the space and began to rearrange the room. Harassment is a legal term. When it is invoked in the wrong place, it serves as a shield. I had watched that maneuver before. People will try to recast someone asking for what is theirs as the perpetrator. The first step of reclaiming is to refuse that recasting. I reached for a document and held it up. The 1924 deed had a county registrar's stamp and an ink signature, Michael H. Bradford, no relation to the family's pride, and a notation I had studied enough to speak plainly. "This shows the original conveyance," I said, voice steady. "It also shows that transfers following that point did not extinguish the interests recorded here. The tax receipts show continual payments from the Washington Trust to services on this property for 2 decades. A man in a navy suit squinted at the paper as if he might coax another story out of the ink. "Could be a clerical error," he offered. "Perhaps," I said. "Clerical errors are remedied by clerks. If you'd like, detective, we can pull the parcel's chain of title right now. It's public information. The clerk's office is closed for the evening, but the records are dredgeable online. He tapped. The world had shrunk to a rectangle. Guests crowded. Someone's phone began recording again, and I noticed later that the angle favored faces that might be made into memes. Social performance is a species of violence. People can be shamed in front of cameras with the speed of an algorithm. At that moment, a flash of another memory arrived, not cinematic, but the kind you carry the way you carry a scar. It was a winter's afternoon in a courthouse where I sat as a young lawyer, and a young man with calloused hands stood before me in shackles. He was not handsome in any way that would make him amenable to headlines. He was raw and frightened and about to be broken. I had been given the discretion to sentence. The prosecutor asked for a term that would have been a life anchor. I looked at the man and the case file and at the options that are so often sold as absolutes. I chose to temper the harshness of the law with a measure of mercy. I offered a sentence that balanced accountability with the chance of restoration. He stood up after his release, years later, and became a man who paid his bills and worked in a job that kept his hands honest. He looked like he had been taught to respect his own life. That choice, small then, had been the hinge on which tonight swung. What I did not know at that courthouse was that mercy can resurface in unexpected places. You plant an act of grace, and sometime later, you notice a sapling where a stump had been. People forget who planted what, but the shade can be real. There is a particular cruelty to being mocked at the place of your origin. The more refined the crowd, the harsher their assumptions about who deserves presence. Pride in those rooms often wears a polite collar. People thought I had come to make a scene. They did not understand I had come to account for a history that had been folded into the margins of ledger books. Detective, Victoria said again, one last attempt to reassert choreography around the evening's program. I won't have my daughter's wedding turned into a legal farce. He looked at her as if he had just been handed a script he did not want to read.
"Ma'am," he said, "I do my duty. If there's a question of ownership, it's something that can be looked at. If there's potential evidence of fraud or misfiling, then it might be a matter for a clerk or a prosecutor, but I can start by pulling the county public record." You could feel the temperature shift in the room. The bartender stopped shaking the cocktail glass. Conversations became smaller, like private calls resumed in the hush between storm and lightning. Someone muttered about the wedding cake. A woman dabbed at her eye with a tissue she kept for the purpose of looking touched. I had not intended to cause this kind of disturbance to a family celebration. I had come purely to look at the oak to see the initials still there. But once I began to lay out evidence, once I made the choice to stand on the concrete of what is true rather than the mutable gossip of the room, there was no folding the story back into the original pleasantries. Ray's fingers moved across his phone with an efficiency that was almost furtive. He pulled up parcel numbers and filings, annotations, and the digitized echoes of signatures. The screen glowed like a witness box. People craned to see, faces registered curiosity, then confusion, then a dawning calculation that perhaps they ought to have paid attention to the envelopes and the sheets of paper that hold us together. I sat a little straighter as if posture could lend gravity. That is the strange thing about our bodies. We use them to make truth palatable. I clip the corners of my sleeves into the rhythm of the facts, because if I don't, the room will try to sculpt me into the story it prefers. "Have you told them who you are?" Ray asked quietly, the two of us speaking in a register for which the crowd was not the intended audience. "I did," I said, "but titles are not arguments." He looked at me then with a half smile, as if he understood the irony. "No, they're not, but sometimes they open doors people thought were welded shut." Before he could scroll further, Victoria's mother, an artful woman with a voice like a gavel, swept across the flagstone and put a hand on her daughter's elbow. "Darling," she whispered. Her whisper had the absolute certainty of those who have never doubted that their social code holds in all weather. "This is a wedding. We will get the authorities if we must." "Please," I said softly, "because there are rooms where argument does not get you very far. The records speak plainly." A hush fell that was not reverential, but investigative. The photographer, who had been giddily capturing the scene for a feed, stopped to look at his screen as if the angle had shifted. He had been hunting for a moment that would make him famous. Fame is a currency that inflates the cruelty of spectacle. Detective Ray tapped on an entry and scrolled. My hands rested on the edge of the briefcase.
"There's an annotation here," Ray said. He scrolled, then tapped a different view that opened a scanned image, an old ledger with a handwriting I recognized by muscle memory. The clerk's stamp matched the one on the deed. The penciled margin note had been made in a hand that looked familiarly ordinary, not the polished calligraphy of a terrific forgery, but the blunt, utilitarian scrivening of a county clerk. "You see this?" he said, pointing the phone toward the crowd. People leaned in. For the first time that evening, I felt the strange wind of possibility, not victory, not yet, but the smell of rain that might cleanse a long dust. The papers under my hands were not the only anchors. The clerk's little note was a human breadcrumb tangled in an otherwise mechanical process. It was small, but it could be the hinge of the story. Victoria's smile had thinned to a line of strategy. Her lawyer flicked his gaze toward a small group of guests he hoped would join him in the chorus of exasperation. "This is nonsense," he said. "You cannot disrupt a wedding because—" "You remember some clause," a guest said lazily. "People have a right to know," Ray answered. His voice, steady and civil, carried more authority than the room had expected. "I'm going to take down a report and consult with the county clerk tomorrow. For now, I can at least note what's here." I watched the microecology of power rearrange around a tiny glowing screen. It was less like watching a courtroom and more like watching a weather change. People adjust their clothing to the new climate. Some will double down on their previous posture. Others will seek cover. I closed the deed and slipped it back into the briefcase. My hands were steady. There is a small domestic satisfaction in closing things after they have been opened and seen. The papers would be cataloged, copied, registered. They would stop being the private inventory of a lifetime and become a public ledger. Michael Bradford stood on the steps, watchful as a man who has been taught to be polite in the presence of attention. I had not expected him to appear so soon. He moved through the crowd with a kind of cautious humility that seemed to belong to a different origin story than his mother's. He paused a respectful distance away, his face comprising a mixture of curiosity, nervousness, and something that looked suspiciously like gratitude. He was not the man from my memory that first came before me in handcuffs years prior. He was a man for whom life had evidently made a course correction. The air after Ray's words felt charged. A few feet separated where people had stood a moment ago and where they chose to stand now. The photographer's fingers hesitated on the shutter. The bride for a moment glanced over, as if asking her new husband with her eyes what to do. The groom's face did not give an instruction. I stood as the crowd's breath held steady, a suspension that could become either thunder or nothing at all. Detective Ray looked at me, then at the briefcase. The night had tilted. That was undeniable. He scrolled through the records a little more before pocketing his phone with the slow deliberation of someone who knows the difference between an immediate arrest and the patience of process. "Ma'am," he said, this time quieter, "I want to make sure you are safe. We can take a report, take witness statements. If anything escalates, call me." I nodded. There are moments when you accept an offer of protection from someone whose job it is because you have to trust the institutions that still function. They are not flawless, but they are a last defense against being alone in a room of people whose affection is purchased by spectacle. Victoria straightened her shoulders as if to reclaim the evening and the choreography of her life. She would not concede easily. Her mouth said with a particular resolution that is easy to recognize, a refusal to let something that questions your arrangements take root. People who habitually wield social privilege treat surprises as personal insults. It is displeasing to them because their life depends on predictability. I thought about the oak tree, my grandfather's initials like a fingerprint in bark. I thought about the brass plaque missing from the gate. I thought about Thomas's hands, the ledger in his head, and the clerk's small penciled note that had shifted the evening's balance. Papers have the patience of slow truth. People do not. When Ray said he would formally take a report, the room did not erupt. It reoriented like a flock sensing a hawk on the horizon. Some left, others lingered. Someone muttered about the wedding timeline. The music resumed the way people resume conversation after a storm. They rearrange their faces to fit the weather, and then they speak as if the weather had been a prop. I gathered my papers and stood. The briefcase was heavier than when I had arrived, as if it had taken on the weight of being known. Thomas gave me a nod that contained the gravity of a man who had watched history roll like tides. "You need anything," he said. His voice was small, but it carried a loyalty I had not expected to find in a room of strangers. "I'll be here a while," I said. I had not planned to stay through the reception, but once you set a course of evidence, it is hard to retreat. Paper is patient, but people are not. You must be present for the unspooling. I moved away from the fountain and toward the pergola, where the string lights painted everything in a forgiving glow. The guests resumed their dances, a little closer to the center now, as if proximity could guarantee safety. The photographer took a last photo of me walking away. The shutter clicked like a small, precise sound. As the night pushed forward, there was a sense that something larger than a wedding was unfolding. It was not a conclusion. It was a shift in the grammar of the evening. When a county clerk's penciled note shows up on a public record, things change. When a groundskeeper remembers names, things change. If evidence can be summoned with the quietness of a phone, then the theater of humiliation becomes less stable. If you want to know how a room decides who belongs, watch what it does when a paper is placed on a table. By the time I closed the deed and slipped it back into the briefcase, the air had already changed enough to be felt like a temperature. People rearranged their faces to the new weather. A few left, their exit as choreographed as their entrance. A few lingered, as feral as gossip permits. The rest shifted into cautious curiosity. Detective Ray moved among them like a man who knows patience is sometimes the truest enforcement of law. Before the night dissolved into argument, there was the small thing I had carried with me that no one expected, the black folder. It had lived, for years, in a storm drawer at my chambers. I had put it there after my father's last papers were boxed, things you do when you want a record to survive temper and time. Inside were things that were plain and aggravatingly bureaucratic: a certified copy of early conveyances, a series of tax receipts stamped by an agency that demands accuracy, trust agreements with signatures that matched my mother's hand, and a certified communication from the federal tax office acknowledging payments associated with the trust account. The folder was not theatrical, it was stubborn. I set it on the table and unfastened the clasp. The seal on the envelope inside flashed. An official impression that belongs to a bureaucracy so large it rarely surprises anyone in the right kind of room. The federal seal on that letter did not change the law of property by itself, but it reorganized what people could claim about character and habit. Federal acknowledgement of a trust's tax compliance is a kind of proof that a practice was not a rumor, but a fact that moved through ledgers and bank routing numbers and the quiet, repeated filing of forms. It is the kind of paper that crowds may not read, but they can feel the weight of when someone sets it down. "What's that?" Margaret asked, voice threading the tense warm light. Her curiosity had the force of a woman trying to maintain distance from an unpleasant truth. It's a certified letter from the federal tax office, I said. It shows receipts and notices connected to the Washington Trust. It confirms long-term accounts and tax filings associated with this property. I said it plainly because complexity becomes something people avoid when they are comfortable being dismissive. A murmur threaded the room. The pink dress group leaned forward in a way entirely unlike their earlier amusement. The photographer's shutter beat slowed, as if the angle he sought had been taken away by the facts. When I placed the pages under the tent light, they gleamed with the mild authority of official ink. Names, dates, bank routing numbers, stamps in blue and red. The federal seal was cold and circular and perfectly boring. Its very ordinariness was disarming. Detective Ray read over my shoulder, nodding in a way that made me think of the courthouse's quiet hallways, those corridors where the world does not perform itself but does its work. "These are verifiable," he said. He tapped his phone to save an image and make a note. "I'll include copies in the report." Victoria's mouth tightened. It is a small, telling muscle. She had relied on the room's ability to adjudicate by rumor. Now documents did the work. Her lawyer, Richard Payton, attempted to rally the night like a battalion. "Even if those are authentic," he said, his voice practiced for high-stakes persuading, "we still must respect the rights of the family hosting this event. Any formal claim requires a filing." "Filing with the clerk is fine," Ray answered, "but you cannot expect the public to ignore public records in front of their faces." "That's not the point," Richard snapped, and in his tone you could hear the late nights of billing and the habit of turning procedure into performance. He looked toward Victoria for instruction. She blinked as if the options had become foreign to her. Michael had been quiet at the edge of the gathering, his jaw set in a way that suggested the weight of being the son of a rulemaker without remembering the rules themselves. He moved now with a purposeful gait that did not seek spectacle but did not avoid it either. He stopped before the table and looked at me, really looked, in a way that made me wonder if he was trying to measure the distance between the man he was and the man he could have been. "You showed me mercy once," he said, so quietly that only those nearest could hear. He had that look of someone who remembers being given a chance so plainly that it bruises to forget. "In a courtroom, you—" He swallowed. He'd rehearsed this line in the privacy of reflection, I thought. "You told me there was a life I could take if I wanted it. His voice faltered like a bridge over too much memory. "I did something different with it. For a while, I thought gratitude was enough. It wasn't. It was cowardice." The words landed not as an accusation, but as a memorial. The room's collective breath stilled again. A small hush swelled around the tent, and for a moment all the decorative lights and clinking glasses receded into the background. "I never asked you to be my savior," Michael continued. "I just needed someone to see me as more than the worst thing I'd done." He looked at his mother and then at the assembled crowd, and his voice grew steadier. "My mother handled everything. I didn't know until months ago that there were documents that traced more of our family's money to services on this land. I didn't look. I'm sorry." "I can't undo what was done, but I can do what I should have done a long time ago." Victoria's face had gone white, not from sudden shame, but from the loss of a script. People who craft their life around the predictability of others' behavior become unmoored when those others act differently than expected. Margaret fanned herself, not out of embarrassment, but to look properly astonished. Richard began to speak, legal instincts taut like a cord, to negotiate delay, to suggest that an evening of celebration is a poor place for receipts. "We can set up a meeting with counsel. We can—"
You can set up a meeting, I said, or we can set terms here in the presence of witnesses and proceed accordingly. I'm not asking for headlines. I'm asking for restoration, acknowledgement, and something that benefits the people who actually keep this place running. That is a fair starting point. Richard's eyebrows arched. He had the look of a man who measures everything in items that can be billed. You are proposing conditions on a property you claim is legally yours? You understand the complexities? Yes, I said. I also understand the optics of exploiting staff and erasing history. I'm not interested in spectacle. I want to correct a wrong. Justice does not care for theater, but it does for evidence and remedy. There are few things that influence a room like the appearance of a plan. To ask for practical remediation is to demand the use of power in a way that produces repair rather than spectacle. I named what I thought reasonable and what would matter. A public apology from the family in the wedding program and the evening's announcements. The restoration of the estate's crest to the gate. A standing scholarship in my family's name for local students interested in trades, plumbing, masonry, the kinds of steady work this house had been built on. A fund for long-serving staff to stabilize their benefits and back pay where underpayment could be demonstrated. Formal recognition of Thomas and others who had tended the land. A timeline to begin the legal process of correcting the chain of title through the clerk's office with a priority review. And reasonable compensation for decisions that relied upon this estate's labor without full transparency. When I spoke, I did not raise my voice. I made no vow to destroy. Instead, I offered a set of actions that would make amends and give the community practical assurances that history would be accounted for. I want to be clear, Ray said, his tone neutral. A criminal referral is separate from civil correction. If evidence shows fraud, that is a matter for prosecutors. If this is a matter of misfiled transfers or unpaid obligations, it is civil. Either way, the clerk's office can prioritize documents if both parties agree to cooperate. Victoria's mouth moved, then stopped. Michael folded his hands and came forward. "Mother," he said softly, "please, do it for the staff. Do it for Thomas." Maybe we can... There are moments when an audience must choose whether to be accomplice or witness. In a room full of social theater, witnesses look for narratives that flatter them. Accomplices tune their moral frequency to avoid discomfort. Michael had chosen against his old life. He stepped further forward and spoke toward the assembled guests, his voice public and private in the same breath. "I was in Judge Washington's court," he said plainly. "I was 20 and I had made decisions that could have ruined me. She saw something I couldn't. She gave me an opportunity that didn't humiliate me into smallness. She told me to build a life. I haven't always honored that gift. Tonight, I own that failure." The statement made the tent brittle with silence. Some leaned away as if the truth might be contagious. Victoria's chin lifted the way a person lifts to reclaim pride. She would not apologize easily. People who have built a life on being owed deference treat apology like debt. "Then you will sign the conditions," I said. "Publicly commit to a course of restitution and make it the thing the guests can read on the program and hear in the announcements. Let it be witnessed. Let it be true in the light." Richard opened his mouth to object. He began to shape a sentence around the idea that a wedding was not a proper forum for binding commitments. That is the default posture. Complex things should be placed into conference rooms long after dessert. But confronted by the groom's visible humility and the general hush, the words stalled. Victoria's lips trembled. It is rare to see a matriarch at a loss. She had cultivated certainty as a garment. Now it chafed. Behind her, servants watched with a mix of hope and suspicion.
Thomas folded his arms across his chest, the line of his jaw remembering a life of steady labor and small indignities. The staff had long inhabited the less noticed parts of the estate, the basement, the back wing, the linen closet. Their labor kept the public display whole. Those who profit from the display often displace the laborers to its margins. "If he signs," Victoria said, voice brittle, "does that mean you drop everything and forgive us?" "Forgiveness is not mine to give as a public spectacle," I replied, "but I can set conditions so that what has been wronged is remedied to the extent the records allow. I will not let this become a theater of absolution without accountability." Michael took a small notebook from his back pocket. He looked at his mother with a steadiness that suggested maturity had replaced denial. Then, in a brief and measured motion, he reached for a pen and signed his name beneath a line that I had provided on a small sheet. The sheet spelled out, in plain legalese accessible to anyone who could read, the conditions we had discussed: public apology, crest restoration, scholarship seed money, staff compensation review, and formal cooperation with the clerk to review title. The signature was not a legal guarantee of transfer. It was a public covenant, witnessed by many, that he committed to repair. The crowd exhaled, a sound that tipped between relief and the peculiar disappointment of those who love spectacle more than correction. Victoria watched his hand move and then pulled her mouth into a tighter line. Pride resists, but sometimes children insist. Richard Peyton, who keeps his professional life like a slow chess match, recognized that public pressure was in that moment a kind of leverage as exacting as any legal motion. He cleared his throat and said he would prepare the instruments necessary for formal discussions with the clerk's office and guarantee that the family would cooperate with the investigation and the civil processes. He asked for a 30-day window to commence the clerk filings and to coordinate with counsel. I agreed to the timeline, knowing that urgency and process are often at odds. If the family intended to be obstructive, public commitments would make obstruction more costly. Detective Ray took statements then and there from a few witnesses: the florist, a bridesmaid who had been close to the scene, and Thomas. He made notes with a professional economy that made me trust the process in a way I rarely did in rooms of spectacle. He did not promise actions he could not deliver. He promised to include the recorded observations in his report. That, in the end, is the only kind of promise law can make in a tent full of diners: the promise to create a record. When Victoria finally spoke, it was short and measured. "If we have wronged you," she said, voice brittle but audible, "I apologize." It landed awkwardly, not fully shaped as contrition, but as an attempt at containment. The apology was not the windfall some would expect, it was a beginning. Michael stepped closer and gave it a shape the words could not. He walked toward Thomas and, without fanfare, put his hand on the man's shoulder and said, "Thank you." Thomas's face folded in something like relief. There is a peculiar private satisfaction I take in small public acts that affect repair rather than ruin. I had come here not to humiliate anyone, but to make the record right. I had no appetite for revenge. My aim was restoration. Mercy had not lost its place in me. It had been what rebuilt my view of justice the day I reduced a sentence in a courtroom because a life demanded another chance. Mercy is not the opposite of justice. It is often its method when oriented toward repair. The night registered the change in ways both small and consequential. The photographer muted his flash for a moment, his lens now cooler. Guests put away their phones with the reluctance of people who had had their narratives rearranged. A few people left, apparently offended by the loss of their expected entertainment. Others stayed, looking at Michael with new attention. The band resumed playing, though the set list had lost its earlier frivolity. Later, when the official work had begun in the small hours, Richard arranged a meeting in a private room at the estate. Papers were exchanged and copies taken. The clerk in my county is a careful woman. She returned my call the next morning with the steady voice of someone who sees thousands of claims and knows the difference between haste and diligence. She said she would expedite a review, not because of any celebrity, but because the documents and the witness statements fell into categories that demanded closer attention. I spent the night at my chambers, where the black folder returned to the drawer after being copied and cataloged. There are rooms in which paper sleeps, and then there are rooms where paper wakes processes. The federal correspondence had been enough to move an ordinary mind. The county clerk's subsequent confirmation was the kind of slow, legal thunder that changes how transactions are ultimately recorded. I made 2 motions that morning, one to the clerk to start the chain of title review, and one to the civil division of the county to note the potential need for corrective conveyance if the chain proved erroneous. If storytelling is a trap, legal process is a tool. It is clinical and unspectacular. It asks for patience. It also sometimes restores things that spectacle cannot touch. The days that followed were a smaller kind of public drama. The family issued a statement in the local paper acknowledging that they had been notified of the claims and pledging cooperation with the county's review. I was named in their release as the person who had brought the records forward. The headline, inevitable and crude, read like a small shorthand for a complicated truth, and I ignored it. Headlines want black and white. Records insist on gray. Thomas received a handwritten note from Michael that week. It thanked him for years of quiet work and invited him to sit with the family to discuss a more formal compensation package. Thomas read the note aloud to the small group in the kitchen where the staff gathered the following Saturday. His voice had the natural cadence of someone accustomed to labor but not accustomed to recognition. He said simply, "It's better than nothing." The phrase landed with a communal sigh. Richard and I met in a conference room. He was still a man of precise words and fast calculations. He presented options designed to protect his client while satisfying public expectations. He asked for time, for the comfort of counsel and counsel's comfort in the old adage that helpful people do not concede everything in a day. I agreed to cooperate so long as the family showed tangible steps. The immediate apology, crest restoration, scholarship funding ceded to a trust account, and a meeting with staff to examine unpaid wages. We each signed a memorandum of understanding, public in principle, private in detail, that would be submitted to the clerk and copied to any relevant agencies. Parts of the work were bureaucratic and unglamorous. We sent certified letters to the title company, requested scanned images of recorded instruments, and asked for a prioritized docket entry. The clerk responded with a courtesy one might expect from someone who values their work. The chain of title review uncovered what we had feared and expected, a series of transfers in the late 20th century that, through a combination of unclear notarizations and a bank's relocation of trust records, had not fully documented the continued interest of the Washington family. The math of it was tedious and bitter. Not a single dramatic theft committed in a dark room, but a slow erosion of attention and an assumption that signage and presence are synonymous with right. Once the clerk's team took the time to compare ledgers, signatures, and routing numbers, the story of misfiling became visible. It takes a particular kind of patience to sift through decades of filings. I learned the names of men and women who had been clerks and county officials years before my time, their initials like breadcrumbs. It is in those marginal notes that disputes find their resolution. A clerk's penciled note is sometimes the hinge of decades. When the county's preliminary report arrived, it was careful in language and measured in tone. It indicated the need for further investigation and recommended that both parties consider mediation to resolve claims with an eye toward restitution for labor and for clear title resolution. The report did not pronounce a final judgment on the title. It did not have the power to do so.
But it did recommend a path forward that relied on documentation and mediation rather than threats. The mediation sessions were slow and not theatrical. We sat at a long table and spoke in the modest language of accountants and human resources people. We discussed the scholarship seed amount, the timeline for returning the crest to the gate, and an agreement that Thomas and several other staffers be offered formal positions with defined benefits. Michael listened and asked questions that showed someone used to being insulated from the nitty-gritty of labor. He apologized in a way that had the slight dryness of a man learning humility, honest and imperfect. Victoria did not attend the first mediation. She sent a representative who later told me she had been processing the collision of pride and accountability. When she finally came, it was to sign an agreement on the public apology and to allow the crest to be restored. The apology, when it was read in the program the following month at a small luncheon that marked the beginning of the restoration work, was not theatrical. It said simply, "We acknowledge that mistakes were made in the chain of ownership and that the Washington family's historical connection to this land deserves respect. We apologize for our part in this oversight and commit to working with the Washington family and the estate staff to make things right." Nobody offered flowers for the apology. Nobody threw confetti. It was just a sentence on paper. But sentences, like deeds, sometimes have the power to change how people live together. There were critics. Social media spun a dozen takes into headlines that varied from righteous to cruel. Some commentators praised me for standing up. Others suggested I had come looking for attention. That is the price of public truth. It stands in a crosswind where everyone with a platform can improvise motive. I ignored the noise. I had neither time nor urge for performative counterspeech. The crest returned in a modest ceremony in late spring. Thomas stood beside me as the workers lifted the bronze plaque back into place on the gate. I watched his hands that had steadied chandeliers and tended graves, hands that knew the precise torque of a bolt. The plaque was not merely metal. It was a visible reconciliation, a brief, solid symbol that history had been acknowledged. The local paper ran a photograph of the crest being restored with the caption the editors felt proper. It did not capture the look on Thomas's face when the plaque slid back into its setting. That look was enough. We established the scholarship as a small trust, seeded by a combination of funds the Bradfords agreed to contribute and additional donations from a few neighbors who felt moved to right an old wrong. The scholarship's criteria were deliberately practical. Students pursuing skilled trades and community-centered vocations would be prioritized. The scholarship's first recipient, a young person from a nearby town who had worked with Thomas in the summers, received the award in a modest ceremony that made the living room of the estate's old caretakers swell with pride. When the young recipient said, "Thank you for opening a door to something steady," I thought of my grandfather humming by the oak. I have had days in life when public humiliation and quiet gratitude cross in the same moment. Standing at that luncheon months later, watching the staff receive recognition, and seeing a small program note that read, "In memory of John Washington, builder of the estate," I felt something akin to completion. It was not a triumph in the celebratory sense. Triumph tastes like victory. What I felt was a steadying of a ledger. And yet, the question that lingered then and stays with me now is not about victory. It is about the way power is used. Power, I have seen, can be exercised to crush or to correct. It can humiliate or it can repair. The options we choose when given authority reveal the shape of who we are. I think of the small acts that helped me become a person who could insist on restoration instead of ruin. My father taught me to tend a ledger with affection, not as a weapon, but as a record of life. My grandfather taught me that land keeps memory in its stones. On the bench, the cases that stuck with me were not the ones that let me show off intellect. They were the ones that forced me to match mercy with accountability. Mercy without consequence is a charity to one's own conscience.
Mercy with accountability seeks the flourishing of others. I have been asked since whether I felt vindicated that night. The answer is always the same. Vindication is a dull thing compared to repair. To be vindicated is to be proven right. To repair is to make right. I prefer the latter. Michael and I spoke months later in a small room at the community center. He had become something quieter but steadier. He volunteered at a job placement program and sat on the scholarship's advisory board. "You gave me a course correction," he said. "You did it without making me smaller, and then you taught me to pause before I assumed I deserved to keep the things that belonged to others." "People assume they own what they can see," I replied. "They forget what keeps it running." He nodded, understanding the balance between being grateful and being responsible. The photographer who had crouched under the tent that night declined to sell the most unflattering image the algorithm would have loved. He called me and apologized for the speed at which the industry had moved him to capture rather than to care. He later sent a print of the oak tree at dawn, shadow and light, in a way that made the carved initials feel like a promise rather than an heirloom. He kept the image out of the feed and gave me a copy. I hung it in my chambers. A year after that night, the estate looked different, not because the mansion had changed, but because the air around it had been rearranged. Staff had modest raises and clearer contracts. The scholarship paid a semester's tuition for 3 students that first year. The crest on the gate had weathered into its rightful place. People still came to the parties and still measured their laughter against the standard of comfort, but there were less cruel assumptions in conversations that passed the gate. I do not pretend this is a perfect fix. The law seldom offers perfection. It offers process, records, and the slow work of adjusting ledgers. The people who were hurt by years of having their labor made invisible do not forget pain overnight. They remember in their joints and in the way they guard their freedom to speak. But when a clerk's penciled note is honored, when a groundskeeper is given a seat at a table he always deserved to be near, those things quietly change how a community lives. The night I was humiliated at a wedding was not the last time someone would whisper judgments about belonging, but it was a time when the slow insistence of paper and the steadiness of a few people who would act on principle made a difference. I could have used my title to saunter in, sign a complaint, and leave. Instead, I stayed. I listened. I demanded correction over spectacle. I asked for mercy to be mirrored in action. If you have ever been dismissed because of how you look, there's a small thing you can do now. Write, "I was seen" in the comments below this piece and tell a brief line of what it felt like. It doesn't change the records, but it makes the room larger. Power used well is not about humiliation for the powerful's amusement. It is about insisting on the dignity of those who often go unacknowledged. When given the chance to wield influence, will you seek to elevate the unseen, or will you build a stage where others are set to perform indignity for your amusement? That is the question that stays with me. If this story made you think about the shape of mercy and power, subscribe and share. Tell us what you would do if you held real authority. Would you use it to make people smaller, or would you use it to build ladders?